So welcome everyone to today's webinar in our trauma-informed training series. Today's webinar is on self-care and community care, getting the balance right. And we're a small group, but a couple of meeting details and etiquette. Please make sure you're on mute. We will reserve some time for questions at different places, and you can unmute and ask your question then. Or if you have a question and want to put it in the chat box, I'll monitor that and make sure we answer all of your questions. And after the webinar, we will have this recording available if you'd like to watch it later. And I will also send out a link to register for our listserv after this. And now I'll turn it over to Addy to get us started.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you, Eliza. Thanks, Eliza, and welcome to Kylan and Heidi. Good to have you guys with us. Just give me one moment here while I pull up my presentation. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about today over the next little under an hour is some thoughts around self-care and what clunkily enough, I think I'm going to call today community care, and we'll get into that, and a little bit about perhaps getting the balance right, or getting into detail a little bit on those two things. Eliza, thank you very much, from the Children's Trust, and Eliza covered logistics. Again, just to sort of reiterate, I think particularly because we just have a couple of people on and a few more people might join. I would, there's again, no expectation on that, but would love to hear from you guys as well. So if at any point you've got something that you want to say, just do feel free to jump in and to share, but don't feel any pressure to do so. I know you may very, very well be multitasking. I flash by up there, but just really briefly a little bit about my background. I am a mental health therapist by training, and then for long number of years now, I've been working in the behavioral health field, primarily in staff training and development, and a little bit of organizational training and development as well. And so for years I've been teaching and preaching, I would say, and loving that, the whole concept of self-care and resilience, and the idea that, like we've I think probably very familiar with analogies now, like put your own oxygen mask on first, or you can't pour from an empty cup, and really focusing on the importance of nourishing and caring for ourselves. And so over time, I think my thinking on this has evolved a little bit, and that perhaps we need to be a little bit critical when we're looking at how much self-care is prescribed for people, and that maybe there's an alternative, or there's an augmentation, or there's a piece of sort of pushing self-care that we need to think about and look at. And so that's, I suppose, what I'd like to talk about today. So this is not so much here's the top 10 tips for self-care at the beginning of 2022, a very difficult year, but it's a little bit more about saying, right, what's good about self-care? What do we want to keep? Where did it, a little bit of where did it come from? Even where did our current sort of self-care industry, maybe we want to look at that a little bit, and then perhaps reflect on the whole idea that, maybe it's not enough. I think over the past 2 years, and I'm not going to get too into that, right? But with our pandemic, I think we've seen the importance of self-care, but I think it's also been highlighted for us that self-care alone, or individual action alone, is not sufficient, and does not serve us. I come as well with a trauma-informed perspective and a trauma-informed background, and thinking about how people are hurt in abusive and traumatic situations, and how people are generally hurt in relationship with other humans. And if we want to heal and be nourished and sustained and get better, we might want to think about that in relationship to other people as well. It's just a little bit of an overall preamble to go back on what it is we'll do today. A little bit more specifically, we'll talk about the role, the importance, and the limitations of self-care. Moving into talking about the value, and perhaps the forgotten or the underrated value and relevancy of community care. I'll offer you sort of some thoughts for takeaway and things to mull over and look into a little bit further, as well as some selected resources for further reading or further exploration. I'm going to start off with this quote, and very much speaks, I suppose, a very ancient quote, and speaking to the sort of the wisdom of looking after ourselves when we can. Oh, pardon me, let me go right back to it. To put the world in order, we must first put the nation in order. To put the nation in order, we must first put the family in order. To put the family in order, we must first cultivate our personal life. We must set our hearts right. And this comes from Confucius. This is ancient wisdom. This is universal wisdom. And I think it's a reminder to us all, in whatever our field of endeavor or work or life's mission or passion might be, that we do want to come back to this touchstone point again and again, that in order to really to put ourselves out there, we need to be okay in our own hearts. We need to set our own selves, our own hearts right. We do need to nourish ourselves. And so, just again, you can put an answer in chat, but feel no pressure to do so. Just reflect for a moment, right? It's just a different way of maybe asking a self-care question. But what sets your heart right? So just what's the first thing, that comes into your mind when you hear that question, and maybe take just a real brief moment to think about that, and perhaps type your answer then into chat. Yeah. So nature, friends, and family. Awesome. Thank you, guys. What powerful things to set our hearts right. Well, carry that with you as we continue through the webinar. All right, gonna jump right into just a perspective on maybe what self-care is sometimes misconstrued as, and what I believe self-care is not. Okay. So self-care is not a quick fix. Okay, self-care is not, right, we got, bubble baths, absolutely part of self-care, with or without the cucumber slices and the wine and the candles. But self-care is not a quick fix for all that's wrong with the world, or for all that's wrong with us, or with our organizations, or with our systems, or whatever the case may be. Another thing, when we're sort of thinking about may we or may we not be getting self-care right, or getting balances right in our lives, is self-care is not, one more thing to tick off a list. It shouldn't really be a to-do item. We want to think about it in a different way. Self-care is not the latest gadget, app, webinar, book, whatever the case may be. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as we go through the webinar. There really has been a commodification of self-care. The self-care industry is absolutely huge. I did a little, internet research to try and see if I could come up with or find a dollar value that's being put on what the self-care industry is worth. To be honest, all of the numbers were meaningless to me. There, but there was kind of started at about 13 billion, and then depending on what was included or not included, went up into the hundreds of billions, and then even one source started to talk about the self-care industry being worth $1 trillion in very short period of time. So those figures just make my mind boggle. But certainly self-care is not about getting out there and buying something. Self-care is not one size fits all. If we look at the word there, caring for the self. In caring for the self, it just makes perfect sense that it's going to have to be, 7 billion different ways that self-care works. Self-care as well, certainly the self-care that's perhaps marketed to us can sometimes seem if it's something that's indulgent, that's fun, that's maybe selfish, or that's perhaps just for women. Okay, none of these things are the case as well. So these are all, these are all things inviting to be critical about sort of self-care that you see presented in this type of way, or invitations to our promotion of self-care in this way. I don't believe either in any way, shape, or form that self-care, and this is certainly very relevant as we move into a new year and hear lots about, resolutions and have our social media feeds, filled with ads for, diet and weight loss programs and all of these things. Self-care is not about a you 2.0 or a better you. Then the other things, and I think these will inform some of our thinking today as well, is self-care is not and should not be a substitute for poor working conditions. Self-care is also not a cure for secondary traumatic stress, if we're thinking about self-care as sort of part of employee wellness programs or an employer offering like a mental health or a self-care day or things like that. Because of stress that a person may be experiencing at their workplace. Self-care is not a cure for secondary traumatic stress. Self-care is also not a cure for any type of mental illness. And we want to think about that too. And I sincerely believe, although the word there in the title is self-care, I sincerely believe that self-care is not something that needs to be done alone, and that typically I don't believe self-care is something that is best done alone. There are of course certain elements or aspects of self-care that need to be done alone, and when we talk about it's not a one size fits all, we think about people who are nourished or their heart set right by being alone in nature, or alone with a book, or alone in a bath, or any of these things. And there's certainly that room and that need for healing and for sustaining and for nourishing ourselves in solitude and in isolation. But I think we want to be very careful of this idea that self-care is something that is that needs to be done alone, that is best done alone, or that is the sole responsibility of an individual. Okay. So I offer this as we're going to kind of look at a couple of different things, but this is one sort of perhaps alternative way to think a little bit more holistically about self-care. And so I think practicing self-care can be, and of course recognizing that this is a very privileged view, but for those of us that can be about making a choice to build a life that you don't need to regularly escape from. I think this can be a really good touchstone question that we ask ourselves, right? If we're continually finding that we need to, download one more self-care app, or buy one more fixing my life journal, or sign up for one more program, or whatever the case may be, or go shop, engage in retail therapy all the time because work is so difficult and so stressful, or all holidays and vacations are fantastic, but if we're only ever looking forward and thinking forward to that, what about taking that step back and saying, well, it's really, nurturing and caring for myself might be more about making that switch to how do I build a life, a daily life that I'm not needing to and that I don't regularly want to make a true escape from. So that's an alternative sort of perspective there. So a lot to think about there. I want to as well then talk about, and this quote or share this quote by Audre Lorde, who is a poet and an activist and a Black female activist from 1934 to 1992. And what she had shared is, caring for myself is not self-indulgence. It is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. And this is an oft shared quote about self-care, but I think often misconstrued and often really distant from its origin as well. And so I think what my understanding, and again, it's very incomplete, but of what Audre Lorde was getting at is that working within a system that actively oppresses groups that she was a part of, and that actively oppresses and keeps people down, that caring for that person that in this case, broad societal systems, and it might be different, was actively saying, trying to quash or oppress or put down or say that you don't matter, to actually do that caring for the self was very, very much a way of saying, no, I will thrive, I will survive. And they can really see how that became political, and that became a way to win, to say, there are these forces trying to oppress me and people like me, but I'm gonna do this work and come out in the other end. And so I think we just want to think about that when we're thinking about self-care as well, and really the value of it, but also sort of honor where that the origin of that and where that comes from, because I think too we often hear this shared and maybe trivialized a little bit, as well as then share that and then move into stuff that's a little bit more commodified when we're talking about self-care. Again, sort of thinking about looking after the self being a way that it can sustain and nourish us to go out and to do the work or to fulfill our passion and our purpose in the way that we want to do so. I think it can be helpful, like I had shared, that we don't want to think about self-care as something that's just another box to tick. So we can think about it, maybe try to have that mind shift, change from self-care being another thing on your plate, another thing to do, and to self-care really being an ethically necessary part of my daily life. We could link this, again, depending on your individual circumstances. This could be closely linked to the quote from Audre Lorde, this idea that in order to be able to continue to do justice work, you need to keep yourself healthy and safe and nourished and full of joy and community and all of these things, and not depleted. So if you're doing work in education or in mental health, right, again, if you're parenting, if you're caring for an elderly family member or a disabled family member, and any of these things, in order to be able to carry out that really important role, we do have sort of an ethical responsibility as well to make sure that we're doing the best we can to keep ourselves the best we can. So they're just kind of some perspective shifts on thinking about and looking at self-care, and really want to be thinking about moving away from self-care being something that we can, sign up to somebody's Instagram account and that takes care of our self-care needs, or buy an expensive piece of equipment. So sort of taking all of that with us, then the next sort of question I have to pose to us collectively is, okay, but where did it come from, and who says that we have to do it alone? So that's what we're going to look at next. But I did put these here for myself this time. I'm not always very good at stopping and pausing. So this is my reminder to pause and check in if anybody has comments or questions or thoughts, or Eliza, I don't know if anything's popped up in chat.
Nothing in the chat, but feel free to unmute and ask if you have a question or comments.
Okay, we'll keep going. So this, I'll read this out for you. I am not sure. I'm originally from Ireland, and so this is an Irish saying or proverb or whatever, and it goes, "Is there scath chéile a warren nadini?" And it doesn't directly translate as this into English, but as close as possible. So it's what it means is that it's under the shelter of each other that people survive, or that people thrive and people live. And so when we think about that, we're there for each other, and yet self-care is what we keep promoting. Little more then on a little more background on that. This, and I wish I could find, I have gone to look and see if I can find if this same study has been done again more recently than 2006, because it's pretty stunning. But this research on social isolation in America, in 1985, people indicated that they were asked, somebody that you could closely confide. There was a very specific question, sort of, if you something very secret, is there somebody that you could trust with a close secret? And so in 1985, people indicated that they had 3 close confidants in their lives. And by 2006, people indicated that they had 0 or 1, but 0 being the most frequent response, close confidence. So, wow, right? We've kind of got that, got all of this sort of pushing of self-care. We've got the fact that we really know, that quote that under the shelter of each other people survive. We've got so many other different ways that we hear that same thing, that we're all in this, together. And then we have this data on social isolation in America and sort of dwindling connections. We think about again, but this picture here, and I share this with permission, I love it. It's from a training I did that was related to suicide prevention here in Bethel, where I live. And we see, I think, really beautifully in this picture that the power, right, of the power of community, the power of holding each other up, the power of caring for each other, the power of community care, as opposed to only a focus on self-care. And so we have people holding up another individual and sharing, we're not going to let your spirit break. And I think it's a beautiful illustration of community care. So self-care really at its worst, I think, can be that everyone, right? Everybody is out there scrambling to care and to look after themselves as best as they possibly can, and doing this because nobody's caring for each other. So we kind of want to think about that for a little bit. That's the worst of self-care, that we're doing it because nobody else is. And I don't know, I don't know if that's what's contributing to the self-care industry growing by, we're told billions and billions every year between 2019 as well and 2020. And I think, COVID certainly might explain some of this, but there was a 250% increase in Google searches for self-care over that period. That's self-care. That's the worst. That's the dark side of self-care, or one of the dark sides of self-care, right? That we're all doing it for ourselves because nobody's doing it for each other. But really, at its best, I think we can have this constantly renewing and sustaining and nourishing and feeding loop between self-care and community care. Community care, peer support, mutual care, mutual aid. It's really hard to find that the right terms here. Peer support is a may just as accurately describe what I'm talking about here, but sometimes peer support, I think, can make certainly me or some of us think maybe a little bit more narrowly of a world where people are supporting peers only specifically in sort of behavioral health or mental health or substance abuse services or developmental disabilities. It kind of has that very that narrower focus. Mutual aid or mutual support also makes sense, but again, I think mutual aid can bring up ideas for people of more sort of organized kind of financial arrangements between people. Community care, again, it doesn't fully capture what we're talking about here, because it can have lots of different connotations or meanings as well. But you know, really what I'm talking about is, and sometimes informally, but sometimes we want to think about how we make this more formal too, although without commodifying, is it's this caring and looking out for each other. You know, in many ways, it might be the way that a very healthy family functions, or friendship group, or whatever the case may be. But really here we're talking about how do we more intentionally bring this into our lives, and I would say particularly into our workplaces as well. But at best, right, if you practice self-care that nourishes and sustains and fills you back up, then you have capacity to engage in caring for others. You've capacity to engage in community care. If you receive support from peers and from your community and help, then that sustains you, right? And then you can give back. Once you've given back, right, then you need to sort of attend to yourself. And we just have this constant sort of loop where ideally at its best, then everybody is being supported and getting the care that they need, but we don't have the necessity that you always need to be providing it for yourself. So this individual here, this community organizer in Vancouver and Canada, I've taken a few of their quotes that I think are really, really helpful and illustrate some of these ideas. Community care is a better stepping stone to justice than self-care. Community care involves a commitment to reduce harm simply through just being together. And then this really speaks to me, I think is very powerful. Shouting self-care at people who actually need community care is how we fail people. When people, right, when people are at their worst and their lowest and they're drowning, or they're crying out for help and support, and if our response to these individuals, whether it's in a personal context or a workplace setting, where it's, kind of practice self-care, I think we're really failing people. Another thought I'd like to share sort of related to community care is that, as well as sort of this idea that you've got to do it alone, when we know that we are social creatures by nature, so this sort of prescribing of only self-care is problematic. But the other idea is that it's kind of built into this idea of prescribing self-care that people know how to look after themselves, that people know how to care for themselves, that people know how to love and nurture and do those things for themselves. And some of us do, and some of us sometimes do. But for some people, that has not been something that they have learned to do yet. For many people with histories of a lot of trauma or a lot of stress or a lot of neglect in their background, a lot of hurt, a lot of harm, they may never have been very well cared for themselves. And so then to step into a caregiving role to yourself, sometimes we really, really need to learn that from somebody else. And so, it may be that a person first needs to experience being truly cared for by others before that's a gift that they can learn, or we can learn to give to ourselves. So it's kind of a little bit dangerous, this idea as well, that everybody knows, has the skills to take care of themselves, regardless of whether they have the time, the resources, or the capacity. The idea that it's sort of skill or knowledge that everybody has. And so then I invite or encourage you to sort of think about the different sort of cultures and communities that we have in Alaska, the different cultures and communities and backgrounds that you belong to, or that we all belong to, and just think about, very broadly, community care principles be better suited to communities or to cultures that are more collectivist, that are more communal in their outlook on life, in their culture and in their structure, than self-care principles. Again, very big, broad brush strokes, but sort of Western and American European cultures tend to be more individualistic in orientation and in focus, and some communities and cultures, some Native American, Alaska Native cultures, Eastern cultures, again, very, very broadly speaking, tend to have a more collectivist way of looking at the world. And so perhaps community care and the principles there just might be better, might be a better fit for a community or a culture that you're living in, working in, or are a part of.
It's not even on any.
So sort of thinking about that, then what might be some thoughts, some ideas, some suggestions for kind of moving forward with sort of keeping all of these things in mind. And so we're not going to say best foot forward, because we're going to be thinking about more than one of us moving and working together. So best feet forward. And I'm going to pause again just in a couple of minutes as well to check in for questions, comments. Love to get your thoughts and feedback too. So I would say, despite my any criticisms of self-care or of the promotion of self-care, to really, yes, we need to continue or increase the absolutely vital practice of nourishing and sustaining yourself as best as you can, and you're privileged to be able to do. And again, I would say honoring, of course, your own need for recovery in solitude, and your need for being sustained by nature and by naps and by baths and all of these things as well, but not to focus only on nourishing and sustaining the self in isolation, to really think about ways that you nourish and sustain yourself in community with other people. I think to really sort of have your eye out for, and to really just be aware of the commodification of self-care that's, I think, increasing by the day and the week in our society. And this idea that self-care is something that we can purchase. And if it's something that we can purchase, it's something that somebody's trying to sell to you. And so, self-care has moved from being, perhaps this vital tool of nourishing that helps us to be able to go out and fulfill life's purpose, has moved from being something that helps us think about creating lives we don't want to escape from, and being people that we don't need to be perfect or a 2.0 version, but people that comfort in our own skin, and into this kind of get better and hashtags, the hashtag self-care and hashtag improvements, and then the money. Again, sort of I'm probably going to end up digging deeper and deeper into this, because I find it fascinating, because I started looking at the self-care writing, the books written for people who are selling products, and you just see again how everything's being spun, and it's not just about buying a house plant anymore, but it's about buying a purifying plant, because it's not just, there's all kinds of reasons why it's fantastic to surround ourselves with nature and house plants, but now your humble house plant is being sold as a purifying self-care tool. Hey, it's just a house. With all this stuff gets very interesting. I think we can fall into those traps. We want to be wary of that. I think we need to think about that loop, that best case scenario of self-care, where we alternate between practicing self-care and community care, so that that nourishing loop and sustaining loop continues and continues. We want to find ways to both give and receive community care, And I think often for people who are on this webinar, the real challenge is not going to be in the giving of community care, but it's going to be in the receiving. So that would be a challenge that I kind of set you to really think about, when do I accept help? When do I, when do I receive that? And, sometimes in accepting help and in receiving community care, we're giving, we're giving a gift to somebody else, because it is great to help others and to feel sustained by that, but we need this to be a loop and not to be a one-way street. So sort of just think about, when do you receive care, and how can you increase instances of that in your life, and not always be it's something that you have to do for yourself. If you're in a position to influence any kind of benefits in workplaces or organizations, or involved in any self-care or wellness programs at work, or sort of, if any of that kind of stuff is in your sphere or scope of influence at all, I'd really challenge you to think about, or to ask people who do have that type of power in organizations, to go beyond individualistic self-care and wellness plans and programs in workplaces. It's an absolute positive, right, that I think in the last few years that workplaces have recognized the sort of importance of paying attention to staff and employee wellness and self-care, and have offered sort of programs around that. But I think we also want to be a little bit perhaps skeptical as well of some of that, and of the outsourcing of organizational responsibility, and organizational responsibility to sort of to look after and to care for their workforce. And self-care is vital, but practicing self-care, isn't a substitute for dealing with systemic issues. It isn't it isn't an excuse for poor working conditions, for low pay, for any type of abusive practices at work, et cetera, et cetera. So I really think we want to sort of challenge this when we see it, and we'll say, well, that's great, but what about working conditions? I also think we can push a little bit and think as well about if we're parts of organizations where self-care and wellness programs are in place, what room is there to invite in and to make more space for community care? So again, maybe, and it's just so different in every situation, but perhaps group supervision, mentor system, sort of buddy or mentor systems at work, sort of meetings that don't necessarily have an agenda, but are a time for people to get together, book or discussion clubs at work. What are some other ways that we can sort of broaden our understanding of sort of wellness programs in a workplace? So I'd really challenge people to think about that a little bit. Also, same with self-care, but particularly if we're talking about community care or peer support, do not forget the importance of the celebration side, and the side where we invite joy into life, and we come together, and we come together to sing when we're strong, as it says here. And that's a really important piece as well of sustaining us, of self-care and community care, and sustaining us through difficult work that we do, and flipping the script on stress and on trauma and all of the hard things, is really making the time to celebrate and to notice the good things. And it's the perfect way as well to sort of to move from self-care into doing things a little more communally. Okay. So I have my pause button there for myself again, and just want to check in and see if people have comments or questions. So I'm just having a look here in chat. And Heidi was sharing in chat, we saying white people have become more and more individualized as society or culture, which reflects the data and the promotion of self-care, and particularly as an industry. Colonization wreaked havoc on community care and cultural ways of being and knowing. Absolutely. Heidi, thank you for sharing that if you're still with us. I really appreciate that. Any other thoughts or comments, questions? All right. I'm going to move into just sharing a few selected resources and ideas maybe for future reading. I always find the work of Laura van der Noot-Lipsky to be really enlightening, and so she has a website that's called Trauma Stewardship, which is also the title of her first book, Trauma Stewardship, and then an excellent second book, which is called The Age of Overwhelm, and I think really speaks to some of the things we've been talking about today too. On her website as well, Trauma Stewardship, she has, I suppose this is, so this in a way is self-care tips or a self-care guide, but I think really well thought out and really focusing on what are those things that nurture us without it being about becoming, the 2.0 version of yourself, or necessarily it being something that you have to spend any money at all on. So I really like this survival guide, and you can download that from the Trauma Stewardship website as well. And I just thought I'd share that with you here. If you wanted to think about doing something with a group of colleagues or a group of friends, something that's maybe, a bit more structured community care wise, you're like, yeah, I want to invite other people to sort of join me in a self-care journey, and want to put some shape on this. kindspring.org have these 21-day challenges, and I've done them a couple of times with workplace colleagues, and it's been a really nice way to build community care at work, and honestly not all that disruptive or all that much work in any way, shape, or form. And you can pick a kindness, a gratitude, or a mindfulness challenge. But if one person, you can also join online ones with people that you don't know, but it can be really nice to set this up with people who are already in your own community. And essentially, once you set this up, you kind of pick a time of day, and you will get a challenge question or prompt for the day. In my experience, it's been really nice to kind of set them up for something like 8 a.m. or, whatever time, so that it's not, your email box isn't full. And really, it's typically just like a reflection question or something like that. And then you can choose or not choose to sort of share that with community members or tick it off the box. But there's some lovely structure on it without it being terribly difficult. So something I encourage you to look at if you're interested in. This article here, it's pretty long. It's probably been, over 20 pages, but from Vice magazine, The Dark Truths Behind Our Obsession with Self-Care. And this in particular, it's not something I've talked a lot about, in particular looks at a little bit more about people experiencing mental illness and poor mental health, and sort of saying that the offloading of healthcare responsibilities from healthcare providers and our government and our workplaces onto the individual, and sort of saying that, hey, just meditate or knit or smile or get purifying plants to deal with very serious mental health challenges is a pretty scary way to go. And it brings us back, or makes me think again of that little piece I had where it said, right, the worst case scenario with self-care, and the worst case scenario being with self-care being like, we're having to take care of ourselves because nobody else is taking care of us. But it's also that in many situations, do you have does the self have the ability, have the capacity to care? And not always. Okay, so it's kind of that outsourcing of healthcare responsibilities. So pretty interesting. I'd encourage it. It's well worth a read. The community resilience. See, I have a hard time saying this. The community resiliency model is something else I'd encourage you to look into. If it's about wellness skills, and it is for people who've experienced trauma, doing wellness groups and workshops and healing work, but very much doing it from a non-individualistic and a community-based and a peer support perspective. And it's a really nice model. So for anybody working very broadly in a behavioral health or substance abuse or trauma related field, it's something I'd encourage you to have a look at. They do some really good work, as do Capacitar, who do work globally, and more broadly than this, but sort of their brief is really working with people in the aftermath of global disasters. And again, I think recognizing that we've got to look out for each other in these situations. And so they teach a lot of body practices, but talk as well about how without advanced degrees, these are things that we can tap into and share and learn from each other. And I think we are very honoring of cultural ways of knowing and ancient wisdoms, and how traditionally we have looked after and have cared for each other, but we somehow as a society have got disjointed from that and seem to be getting pulled further away from it. So I think it can help bring us back to that, and has some really practical ways and suggestions we can move there. Okay. So as we get ready to wrap up, is there any one thought, one takeaway, one question that I'm still want to have answered, or that I'm going to, look into more for myself, that you might take away from today's webinar? So we don't have many people on, so if anybody certainly wants to unmute and share that thought, feel free, or take a minute and then you could share it in chat.
I very much enjoyed listening. This is Brenda I'm up in Fairbanks, and you made a statement. You said, when do we receive care? I may have not written this down exactly because I was trying to jot it afterwards. And basically we need this to be a loop, not a one-way street. And I think that we don't necessarily always have that playing in our brain about how are we refilling? And I think I'm going to put that on my wall. So thank you for that.
Awesome. Thank you, Brenda. I really appreciate that. Yeah, it's a good reminder to us all.
Yeah, and I'll just say thank you so much for this presentation and just this conversation in general. I feel like I've been to so many self-care webinars and trainings, and I've always missed that part about the community, because I do feel like that's extremely important, and trying to create that in my office amongst my coworkers too. So I just really appreciate all the resources you shared, and I'm gonna try that Kind Spring thing. So thank you.
Oh, great. Yeah, no, if conversations about self-care are already happening in your workplace, then I think this can be Kind Spring could be a lovely way to sort of nudge it gently in an additional direction. So that's really great to hear. Thanks, Heidi. Okay, well, yep, we are getting close to time, so we'll wrap it up. So I'm gonna end on this quote. This comes from James Baldwin. We've got to be as clear-headed about human beings as possible, because we are still each other's hope. And so this quote gives me hope, and I despair from time to time, as no doubt we all do. But at the end of the day, we are each other's hope, and we are each other's source of strength too. And sometimes we just have to just step back and maybe know what we've known all along, and just reflect on that, and be there for each other, and ask for others to be there for us when that's what we need. So thank you all for spending this time here with me this lunchtime. And again, my email and phone number are there. And so if I can help it anyway in the future, or there's something you're trying to remember, or a resource you're looking for that wasn't shared, just let me know, and I do my best to get back to you, as I know Eliza at the Children's Trust would and will as well. So thank you, everybody, and thank you, Eliza.
Yeah, thank you so much, Addy, and thank you all for being here. Just a note, our next trauma-informed training will be on February 22nd. That's a Tuesday, same time, 12 to 1. And it will be on trauma-informed physical environments. So it's called It Starts at the Front Door, Considerations for a Trauma-Informed Culturally Relevant Physical Environment. And the link to register for that will be sent out the same time I send out the recording of this webinar. So thanks again for being here, and we hope to see you all at the next webinar.